Good morning to all from Singapore, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Saiduddin Faridi, and on behalf of the Institute of South Asian Studies, I would like to welcome you all to the ISAS International Conference on South Asia 2023. We will now commence with the second roundtable, which is titled Everyday Experiences of the State in South Asia. And we are thrilled to have a great panel with us today. We are joined by Professor Dina M. Siddiqui, Clinical Associate Professor, Global Liberal Studies at the New York University, and affiliated faculty at the Hagop Kevorkian Center for Near East Studies, New York University at Abu Dhabi. We are also joined by Dr. Marcus Texel, Reader in Muslim Societies in South Asia at the Department of History at Royal Holloway, University of London. And we're also joined by Dr. Tamali Kitsiri, Senior Lecturer at the Department of Geography at the University of Peradeniya. This roundtable will be moderated by Dr. Amit Ranjan, who's a research fellow here at the Institute of South Asian Studies at NUS. A reminder for the audience that you can use the Q&A function on Zoom to submit any questions that you may have during the course of the roundtable. Thank you very much, and I will now hand over the session to Dr. Ranjan.
Thank you, Saeed. Welcome to the panelists and the audience. This session is on everyday experience of the state in South Asia. We have wonderful panelists to speak on. Before I go to the panelists, I want to make 5 brief points. First, everyday experience of the South Asian states differs from one group to another. The COVID-19 unveiled the darker side of many countries. The effect of pandemic was divided on the basis of class. The affluent and upper middle class survived. However, the brunt of the pandemic fell mainly on the millions of poor population in respective South Asian countries. Second, downsliding of democracy and rise of populist leaders are shrinking public space to express dissent against the elected government. Third, it has been advocated that digitalization and artificial technology have enabled participatory democracy, but they have also helped the states to easily surveil their citizens. Fourth, the South Asian states are selectively absent from many places, which helps the extra and non-constitutional bodies to capture many of those space and flourish. Finally, the South Asian states' behavior towards minority groups, ethnic and religious, had always been under question, and this has increased over the years. So with these 5 points, on the everyday experience of the South Asian states, I would like to welcome the first speaker in this session, Professor Dina Siddiqui. Professor Siddiqui, please.
Thank you. Should I start? Okay. All right. Thank you so much. Thank you, Amit. We have corresponded in different contexts, so it's very nice to see you. Thank you to the organizers, all of you, Rajni and others, for inviting me. I'm very happy to be here and to have a chance to put my work on garment workers, basically, into conversation with the literature on the state in South Asia. It's not something I generally do, so I'm actually taking this opportunity to think through certain things. I'm very sorry that the time difference makes it impossible for me to think of hearing the other panels and to follow most of them. But anyway, it's also a little bit jarring to go about business as usual, given the genocidal violence in our mix, but there we are. Anyway, since this is a roundtable and I have about 10 to 12 minutes, I want to present my ideas a little bit informally, if possible. All right. I have 3 basic points I want to elaborate on, and they're preliminary thoughts that came to me as I was reading their description of the roundtable and the description of the conference, and they come from my long experience of working on labor issues in the garment export industry in Bangladesh. So here goes, and I realize there's another panel on the surveillance state, but I'll be talking about surveillance too. My first point is that for militant workers and labor organizers in Bangladesh's garment export industry, I argue that the most concrete manifestation or materialization of their engagement with the state, at least at the everyday level, is through the experience of being surveilled or interrogated by various intelligence services, as well as by the police, but not so much by the police. Correspondingly, it is the fear, uncertainty, suspicion of being under surveillance, of having one's phone tapped, having plainclothes police personnel present at rallies or internal meetings, getting threatening phone calls from unknown numbers, presumably from the DGFIS and the NSI to big intelligence agencies. All of these, the uncertainty and the unknowing and the fear become technologies of governance, basically. That's one of the things that happens that I'm arguing. The police may be the more visible state of the face for many people, but it is the production of fear and uncertainty, the possible consequences of surveillance that shapes both action and subjectivity among the group of people with whom I'm familiar. And paradoxically, as I want to show, this is a forced engagement with the state. This is not going to the state to claim a right of citizenship, right? These forced engagements often happen in the language of hospitality, or are framed through a rhetoric of hospitality, but they also undo these lines between state and capital in particular, but also state and society, because the language of hospitality is also the language of domesticity. It's the language where you can be comfortable. But actually, this everyday harassment of garment workers and labor leaders, often in something like, oh, make yourself at home, please eat something, when you've been forced into the headquarters of an intelligence office, they hold veiled and threatening meanings. So, Cholin iktu cha khe ashi. Come, let's have a cup of tea at our office, are ominous words that no labor activist wants to hear. This is a command, not an invitation. It is not an invitation one can refuse, right? And there is no guarantee of outcome, no guarantee of return. Labor activists and organizers live in the shadow of the intelligence services, the DGFI and the NSI and the police, including the industrial police, which I will talk about. They learn to live with everyday surveillance, and this is their engagement with the state, I would say. Now, 5 years ago, I wrote about the 2010 arrest of a prominent left-wing labor leader, Mushrifa Mishu, and she'd been arrested in 2010 at that time, and I had access to her what's called the first information report, which I assume everybody who does South Asia will know. It's what it's what you present at the police station. And it's a very interesting to see the first information report in which accusations of conspiracy, sedition, inciting violence, all of that was in there. But that is a traditional mode of disciplining unruly labor, right? And other people. Mushrifa Mishu had been arrested multiple times, right? And so lodging false cases around her is a time-honored counter insurgency measure. Let me put on my glasses here. In one of these, so that's there. And I think something has shifted from 2010 to 2023 that I want to talk about, the shifts. I want to historicize these particular engagements with the state. So when I shared the description of Mishu's arrest in 2010, as recounted in the official record of the organization that helped her, the Bangladesh Legal Aid and Services Trust, or BLAST, was very, very telling. The sequence of events, which I won't read out to you, as narrated for Blast Records, that was actually used in court, basically echoes popular accounts of raids in the USA to detain undocumented persons or FBI agents raiding people to get raiding homes on the trail of a potential terrorist. It's kind of in that language, but in that mode, right? In that rhetorical mode in the FIR. Now, it could be argued that the Bangladeshi state gives carte blanche to intelligence services to surveil, detain, and disappear unruly or disobedient workers. Certainly, the threat of being disappeared or murdered in extrajudicial killings, for which the Bangladeshi state currently is very well known, is real, and it's happened to people like Aminul Islam, you know. I contend that today, given the global gaze on Bangladesh's politics, particularly on upcoming elections, but even before that, there's been a subtle shift from the very obvious picking up and disappearing to the everyday mundane harassment, something that's invisible, something that's more intangible in the realm of fear, in the realm of what could happen, in the realm of uncertainty. And here I want to refer to the words of someone I'm calling Najma Begum, a fairly prominent female labor organizer, someone I've known for several years, but who's not one of those global celebrities that are always trotting around the world, but visible in the national space. She called me, I didn't call her. This was not really part of the field work. It's really interesting. It just became really appropriate. She called me a couple of weeks ago because she was worried about herself. She wants to leave the country. And she said, Appa, I haven't been, this is my translation, I haven't been able to work in the field, mat, she literally, the field being doing organizing work. I haven't been able to be in the mat for months now. It's impossible. If you raise your voice, you're labeled BNP, which is the opposition. You're liable to be arrested. You could be disappeared. After all, Bangladesh is the land of goom or disappearances. But none of that happens to me. I don't get false cases recorded against me either. I just get constant phone calls. They call to ask me how I am, what my plans are for the day. They arrive at my workplace first thing in the morning and ask me to go with them. There's always this they. They will waste my whole day. Then she goes on to describe what seems like something out of an absurdist horror movie about how she gets taken to the headquarters of the NSI or DGFI, and she goes to one room which has CCTVs, which leads into another slightly smaller room with CCTVs, and she goes on until they finally put her in one room where all of the CCTV, but there's a huge spread of food and a sofa. And they say, please have some nashta, please do this and then they basically make her wait. And I could go on, but we don't have time. It's a really fascinating story I just heard from her. But this is very subtle, this engagement with the threat. And they let her go home or go back to the office. Okay, this is a 9 to 6 kind of operation. So that's one of these things. My second point is, will you please tell me when my 10 minutes are over and then I'll start trying to wrap up? Thank you, Amit.
Go on.
So my second point is that there's the new surveillance state in Bangladesh needs to be historicized. Because surveillance itself surely existed earlier, but it's been intensified. And there's more of an acceptability. It's much more open. The question is why? I should clarify that following many others, I find it useful to think of the state as an assemblage of institutions, very inconsistent. It's not one monolithic, it's singularity, obviously, but it's not necessarily coherent. And there's inconsistencies between the various places or faces or voices of the state, right? That aside, but I'm going to use the state as a word because it's just easier. We can trace the intensification of surveillance culture in Bangladesh to broader global shifts, in the general neoliberal reconfiguration of state institutions to serve transnational and national capital, rather than labor over the past few decades. And this tilt toward capital has become an uncontested feature of places of post-colonial neoliberal development regimes, such as in Bangladesh. Because, and I think this is why would people agree? This is, in the last 20, 30 years, since the fall, since the rise of a kind of neoliberal triumph, even if that's been eclipsed a little bit, we also have this language of democracy, this grammar of democracy and workers' rights. So how do you reconcile freedom and the right to strike and workers' rights to have all kinds of things with this constant surveillance? And I suggest using it is because much of this is cast in the name of national development. And we're talking about a post-colonial state in which the state, despite all of the disenchantments with the state, is trying to do just, or is still meant to do just that, at least in Bangladesh. Okay, it's a very, perhaps it's a specific context, but I don't think so. There are claims on the state. That's what the claim is. The state is supposed to develop the nation, right? And this is where I find the work of Aiwa Ong on neoliberalism as exception and various exceptions to neoliberalism, or the exceptions that neoliberalism engenders, to be really useful. Basically, what's happened is the balance of power between labor and capital has shifted, right? At least in my field of work. And what's happened, and Kanchan Ruanpura, who is going to be later on, tomorrow, I think, or maybe later today, I don't know when she is, who's one of the speakers in the conference, has written very powerfully about what this means for labor laws in Sri Lanka. But I see something somewhat similar happening about this shift in power. Neoliberal forms of governing come with their own grammar of democracy, as I just meant, so that any contradictions presented by state surveillance, control, and regulation, that's always needed to keep labor in its place, because you want to protect your export processing zones. You want to tell people, the Zaras of the world, that they can outsource to Bangladesh because it's safe, right? As well as, ethical, but I'm not going to go into the ethicality right now. But the repression on labor can be papered over by the idea that all of this is meant to promote this thing called national development. So I want to give you a couple of examples. The first is that the example of the industrial police in 2010 in Bangladesh, which was meant to apparently protect labor and the industry, but which everybody knows is an arm of capital. So again, this is a police. This is something, it's literally an arm, legally part of the national police, but we all know, and nobody really denies, that it works for the Bangladesh industrial lobby. It works like thugs work, but it's just official. So we have thugs disciplining labor, but we also now have an official police force disciplining labor. That's one thing. And I won't go into the next example because I want to go to the end. So I want to say my third point is that the appeal to development in Bangladesh is always mediated through invocations of the national interest. And this is probably true in other places too. And the BGMEA, the powerful garment lobby, does that in many, many ways. It tries to say that somehow it is also responsible for it's part of Bangladesh's infrastructural growth. But the assumption that the interests of the nation correspond to the interests of garment workers does critical work here. Basically, garment workers are told you know, you have to be good for the sake, you have to sacrifice for the sake of the nation. And that means that you can't just demand, you know, there's a huge minimum wage action going on right now in Bangladesh. And it's a very interesting thing because the kind of minimum wages that are being wanted are way demanded, are way below living wages. But the way in which you would think the government and capital are, you know, giving out the figures they're giving out, it seems like they're almost doing workers a favor, when in fact it's nothing of the sort. But all of that gets veiled over, or covered over in the language of, oh my God, this is about the national economy. Our economy runs on this industry, and therefore we must all put together, you know, put our bodies and our lives together on the line to protect the nation and the industry. And of course, the people who are meant to sacrifice the most are the workers. But the reason the title of my talk, and, you know, in the course of an online talk show platformed on Facebook in August, actually, pitched toward workers in Bangladesh's garment industry, a young female labor organizer made an audacious, if not fantastical, suggestion. She said, and there's a whole project, you know, I don't know if it's a project, a rebranding of Bangladesh as becoming smart Bangladesh with a smart economy. And she says, and I want to close with her words and the implications of her words. She says, you know, if we have smart factories, which are green factories, so-called, and a smart economy, why shouldn't we demand smart wages? Why should we stop at wages that just about allow us to survive? Why should we not be allowed to dream? So here we have somebody who is pushing against this whole structure of how much you can even think about what you can claim, right? And this is in the backdrop of one of the garment factory owners saying, we just need to have a minimum wage that will allow both the industry to survive, owners to survive. And in Bangla, he says that the shromik, the workers, and the malik, the owners, both have to both of them have to be able to make enough money to live and eat, as though the malik and the owner is making just enough to eat, you know, so as though, but also limiting what workers should demand to basically the social reproduction of labor, right? That's what it's doing. And she pushes back against that. And I want to ask what that really means in terms of the state. I think what this young woman is doing is really trying to renegotiate or challenge an accepted kind of contract between the state and the citizen, basically. So I will leave it at that. I'm assuming my time is kind of up. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks, Professor Deena. About the sacrifice, I remember in 1949, when India just became independent, Nehru went to a village in Indian state of Orissa, where the Hirakund Dam affected around 150,000 people. And he said that, quote, that if you have to sacrifice for the nation and for development. So same happened with Bhakran. So development has always been linked with the sacrifice. So, and it's also going on. And second point, I want to say that about surveillance you talk. You know, when I ask some Bangladeshi scholars, mainly who are based in Bangladesh, to write for a journal editing or for a book, they say, no, I cannot write. Even if they are outside, they say that our families are back in Bangladesh, so we cannot be too critical. There's a something. So those things happen, and it's not about South Asia. It's not about the Bangladesh. Almost all post-colonial South Asian states and other states also. So thanks for your wonderful presentation. We'll come back during the question and answer session. Now I request Dr. Marcus to please make his presentation. Dr. Marcus.
Okay, well, thanks very much. Can you hear me properly?
Yeah, we can hear.
Okay, that's great. Well, first, thanks for inviting me. Your invitation came at a very welcome time, actually, because I'm in Malaysia at the moment, in Kuala Lumpur, so quite close to where you are, starting a new research project on the evolution of Islamic economics and Muslim responses to neoliberalism. But I haven't really advanced that enough to present on that. But asking me to come and speak about the everyday state in South Asia, which takes me back to my last project on the history of mass housing in Pakistan in the 1950s and 60s, really gives me a great opportunity to actually connect the two projects a little bit in my thinking. So this is also what I'm trying to do. I probably won't have much time to actually speak about the Islamic economics project very much, but I think that's also appropriate in terms of where the project is and what this conference is about. Now, let me first say that I'm a historian and not a social scientist, so I'm always interested in plotting large developments and understanding larger developments. And in the context of this particular presentation, I think my big question here is, when did the neoliberal state or neoliberal modes of governance actually begin? I think there's a standard historiography out there, very often centered on India, that tends to associate neoliberalism almost exclusively with economic liberalization from the 1980s onwards. But if we think about neoliberalism as a mode of governance and also link it back to the everyday state, I feel that we could probably revise this particular chronology and maybe even see beginnings of neoliberalism earlier in the 1960s, for example. So I see some points in my own research. So that would be one of my big questions that perhaps we can pick up in discussion. The second big question really concerns the use of theory. When I did my work about mass housing in Pakistan, well, around between 2008 perhaps and 2015, when my book came out, I was still enthralled to, first of all, Foucault. So if anybody who's seen my book will see that I'm trying to do a critical but still very much indebted use of Foucault and his distinction between different forms of power: sovereign power, disciplinary power, managerial power, and also in particular his own thoughts about the evolution of neoliberalism that he tracked in the context of German ordoliberalism in one of his lecture cycles. And also came out of bigger discussions about the everyday state, which came around between 2000 and 2005, and then a particular focus on sovereignty and the sovereign everyday state. So the theatrical state, the monumental state, the work of Thomas Blom-Hansen, was kind of lurking there in the background. And I guess the kind of big question for me here, when it comes to understand the present, is really to make sense of the coming together, on the one hand, a proliferation of what you could call neoliberal managerial modes of governance, where the distinctions between public and private, between state and non-state, between private sector, public sector, etc., are actually blurred. And a lot of what we would have called political in an earlier setting is now seen as, let's say, consumer choice or economic choice. But at the same time, as this is happening, you also get almost a kind of blowing out of all proportions of the theatrical and monumental state. So you get a proliferation of instances when the state needs to set itself into scene, stage itself, in order to attain a very high profile in the everyday lives of citizens. And I'm really trying to understand how these two things go together, whether there's a causal link or whether there's a contradiction. And that again takes me back to my work on mass housing in Pakistan in the 1950s and 60s. So I have a few slides which I'm going to share now. I hope this works. So can you see my slideshow now?
No, it's not.
You can't? Okay, hang on. No, I forgot to press. Can you now? Okay. So this is just a cover sheet, which we don't really need. So let me just advance from the cover sheet to the slideshow. So can you see the first slide with pictures on?
Yeah, we can.
Yeah,
see
okay,
it.
great. So this is just a reminder quickly of what my project was all about. It's been published in several articles, different journals. The latest is probably about 3 years ago now, but then the main piece is the book with CUP from 2014, Islamabad and the Politics of International Development in Pakistan. And basically, I was interested in mass housing initiatives that attained global prominence in the late 1950s and early 1960s, well, all the way to the late 1960s, really, under General Ayub Khan. There was first the creation of a massive new satellite town just outside Karachi in Korangi, which resettled several hundred thousands of people at an absolutely astonishing time scale of 6 months. So between giving the go-ahead to the project and the actual first people moving in was only 6 months, which was seen as a major proof that the military regime of General Ayub Khan was, first of all, legitimate and at the same time able to carry out the kind of very ambitious development projects that were seen as key to regime legitimacy at the time. So that connects us right back to the first speaker here. Development was very much a very important legitimizing plank for the Pakistani state, both domestically, but also, and that's crucial, also internationally, because what I try to do is really to offer a vertical analysis of these mega projects of the 1950s and 60s, starting with the international politics of international aid, how different institutions in the United States, both government and non-government, were sometimes in conflictual relationships, sometimes worked together in order to achieve geopolitical aims for the US, which then had an impact on the selection of international consultants. And here I focused quite a lot on C.A. Doxiadis, a Greek guy who was involved in mass housing in about 30 countries around the world, particularly in the Cold War context, who was a trusted private partner, often of American aid, but also other agencies, who then got in touch, of course, with the military regime and its bureaucrats. So there's a military bureaucratic nexus. And then when this all got implemented, of course, we also then have how all of this impacted everyday experiences of development. And here, for example, I could look into basic democracies, as it was called, Ayub Khan's kind of truncated local democratic system. I found some documents relating to that, and also then kind of actually shedding some light on how these mega projects actually impacted people on the ground, down to individuals. And throughout my analysis, I tried to distinguish different modes of governmentality in order to kind of understand how to describe a developmental governmentality in the case of Pakistan. So what does it mean to be a developmentalist state in this period, in this particular place, and how is that actually experienced by the people? And I could see different modalities of power existing next to each other and sometimes even contradicting each other. So, for example, sovereign power was very manifest in the decisionism of instituting this project in the first place, also the clearance of slum dwellers from the center of Karachi and the forcible settlement. You can see that, for example, in the imposition of impossibly short timescales, which are really all about demonstrating the ability to do something and preferring this kind of theatrical execution of agency to actually lasting and thought through solutions. You could find disciplinary power at work in various ways. Of course, in the design of these new neighborhoods, its implication with certain social norms about class, but also ethnic origin, the kind of people who were settled where, and the way they were settled, a certain kind of disciplinary agenda also to create a new kind of lower middle class modernity fit for a Cold War context. And you could also see managerial modes of governance where actually planners and also government agencies stepped back and were very clear that they really wanted people themselves to decide what to do and how to relate to these new mass housing developments in which they were now dumped after being cleared out of the center of Karachi, where actually non-intervention and creating spaces for people to decide for themselves appear to be the safest and most effective way of governing these spaces. So a managerial, and you could say an extension, perhaps neoliberal mode of governance was also part of this mix. So this is what I was trying to understand, but I just wanted to kind of target it all around a couple of key questions to kind of bring it together. And I just want to use a single image here to bring all my questions together that I wanted to bring to this workshop. I mean, first of all, I think it's the old question again of what the state actually is and how we should understand the state, particularly if we want to foreground everyday experiences and really approach the state as in the shape of the everyday state. Now, one thing I really learned from this project about mass housing was that it wasn't always very easy to actually identify where the state and non-state, where the state ended and began, and non-state actors came in. And I think this picture in a way kind of sums it up. So what you see here is one of the first houses built in Korangi. For those of you who can read the sign, this is a dispensary for Ayurvedic medicine, Unani medicine by a Hakim, so a practitioner of what we could call traditional medicine, but actually a form of medical knowledge that is fairly well established in South Asia, officially recognized in India, less so in Pakistan, but resorted to by a lot of people in their everyday life. This dispensary is actually in a private house. And we now see a delegation of two people. On the left, a Greek development expert who was sent by C.A. Doxiadis. So he's actually an employee of the Doxiadis Corporation in Athens, tasked to oversee the Korangi project in the particular locality. You can see the plan and so on rolled up under his arm. You can also notice the shorts. So it clearly comes from somewhere else and really struggles to make sense of what is going on in Pakistan. And you can see that in the documents as well. And on the right of the Hakim in the middle is a Pakistani government bureaucrat who is also tasked with the execution of the Korangi plan. Now, we don't really know what the actual occasion of this visit was, but I think it has something to do with zoning legislation and the unauthorized use of private houses for commercial purposes. So this Hakim basically used the private house that was allocated to him as a dispensary, and he didn't set up shop in one of the dedicated and planned bazaar centers that the Greek planners were particularly kind of keen on providing. Now, what you can see here is that the everyday state that this Hakim now encounters consists both of state and non-state actors, people who come from the private sector, people who come from abroad. So it's not just a national state, it's a state that's internationally networked and backed up by international aid flows. But you also see other things that, for example, if you look carefully, you see above the window, there's a little marker. So it's of course the state that has allocated this house, the state that has mapped this space, has given it a kind of bureaucratic signage in order to make it governable, in order to make it surveillable and understandable. And at the same time, if we focus more on the figure of the Hakim himself, now he is somebody who is providing healthcare in this new center, this new urban center of Korangi, where official planners were not able to actually establish enough doctors and clinics in time. He, of course, is not a state actor, but people come to him to receive a service that in other contexts we would see as part of the everyday state and part of an everyday state institution. But he's not entirely independent of the state either, because, of course, his operation in a place like Korangi is directly governed by the legal framework in Pakistan that assigns a certain place to Unani to Unani medicine, in relationship to other forms of medicine, Western biomedicine, for example. So you can see that the everyday state is not really very easily defined. It's a kind of network of various institutions that stretch from the international, the global, all the way down to the local. And it's also a set of institutions, a governmental framework that actually allocates deliberately a lot of agency to non-state actors. So the Pakistani state was quite happy that this Unani practitioner could actually provide a form of medicine that local working class people were perfectly happy to access, because it wasn't able or willing to actually provide Western biomedicine in this particular locality. So this raises all sorts of questions, I think, that need to be historicized about the relationship between a strong state and a weak state, between a state that tries to use sovereign power in order to put up a show and impress its citizens or create citizens, but also a state that actually already at that time tries to utilize absences of governance in order to make governance easier. So there's a certain paradox there about managerialism, which of course is expressed in its fullest term in the neoliberal literature on politics. And you see the beginnings of that actually in the planning discourse itself, because planners like Doxiadis very often talk about the need to let local people get on with it and decide themselves, for example, how they want to make use of a house, how they want to interact with urban space, and also as sources of information. It's very often said that the planner is unable ultimately to understand fully all the complexity of local information in order to provide full solutions. And the only way you can actually get that is by giving people who are the local residents a little bit more of a role. But despite making such claims, of course, then very often we get the opposite as well. We get the planners deciding for local people and getting very grumpy if they don't stick to their planning. So for instance, Doxiadis' planner, including the man you can see in this image, were tasked to design even the interior of the houses that were allocated to slum resettlement populations, down to the kind of fireplace that they were meant to use. And that was seen as a kind of great act of cultural sensitivity, and as emblematic of the kind of state and modern science who really understand people better than they understand themselves. But we have to also see that this kind of high modernism that James Scott would kind of go off on was always counterbalanced by a different discourse that actually said that not governing may actually be the best way of keeping control, of keeping influence. Okay, so this is what I wanted to say about my older work. Now, just a very, very quick link to what I am doing now, and Islamic economics, Islamic finance, and so on, which is much more present-oriented, although as a historian, again, I'm interested in how it all started in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. But here again, we have a situation where private consumer decisions, people, for example, going to an Islamic bank and taking out an Islamic loan or investing in an Islamic finance vehicle, or shopping from a halal business of some form, of which there is many, from insurance brokerages all the way to kind of food stuff and other things. So how a consumer decision that's essentially non-political actually becomes a major vehicle of identity expression, but also becomes a legitimizing force for the state, who has created the legal framework in which these choices can be made. So a legal framework in which Islamic finance, halal industries, and so on are favored. So the state can, in other words, can encourage, can relate to its citizens through private, non-state acts of consumption, in a kind of very offhanded way, and actually make fairly strong claims about the identity that people want to express, and do that also in a way that is very strangely depoliticized, because it happens in the shape of a consumer choice. And of course, because it's economic, it can again relate it back to a governmentality of development and a dream of a better tomorrow. So I'm really trying to understand these things, and I want to end here. I can't see how much time I've taken, but it was probably too much, but thank you.
Thank you, Marcus, for a wonderful presentation. And you're absolutely correct that in this new liberal era, the managerial system has been accepted. And in this era, time, you never know where the state is and where it is not, giving space to private institutions, non-state actors to play a role. However, state has control over something, and state is present in direct way. So it's not directly present. And talking about Orangutan, I remember there's a interesting thing about Lalu Khet near Karachi, and that is development and ethnic conflict. Everything started soon after the state entered, and then is of the ethnic clashes.
Just a quick thing, it's Korangi, not Orangi. There's two different projects.
Yeah. So thanks for your wonderful presentation, and we will discuss more during the question and answer session. Now I would like to invite Professor Thamali.
Actually, I'm Dr. Thamali, Professor. Shall I share my slides?
Yeah, you can.
Hope the slides are clear.
Yeah, it's okay.
Okay, so good morning to everyone. Thank you very much to the organizing committee of the ISAS International Conference on South Asia 2023 for having me in this session on everyday experiences of the state in South Asia. And I really want to thank Rajni Gamage and Ramita Iyer for from the Institute of South Asian Studies for inviting me and making this event possible. And I'm really excited to share my presentation from my newest project and newest field work in Sri Lanka. Let me begin my talk with two anecdotes. So following the Google map, my research team were quite surprised to come to a destination called Tanjung Tanna. According to Google, it was our destination. But we didn't want to go to Tanjung Tanna. We were actually traveling to Kuragala, a village in Ratnapura district in Sri Lanka. While doing fieldwork in Tanjung Tanna, I realized that the village is well known as Kuragala among outsiders. Although my purpose in Kuragala was to observe recent changes occurred in the Kuragala archaeological site, I traveled around its immediate neighborhood, Tanjung Tanna, talking to a couple of residents before visiting Kuragala. The landscape of Tanjung Tanna is dominated by its agriculture and, more importantly, its harshness. If you can see this photograph, at the middle you see the name board of Tanjung Tanna, where the village begins, and two other photographs show the landscape of Tanjung Tanna. In the evening, while traveling to Kuragala, we passed hundreds of crowded buses returning from Kuragala, and another dozens of buses had parked at the entrance of Kuragala. You might now have the question of what is Kuragala? To answer that question, I quote Mahinda Digalla, who studied Kuragala in 2018 and identified Kuragala as a sacred site for both Buddhists and Muslims. I quote Digalla's description. Kuragala is an important sacred site, both historically and religiously, and two contemporary religious communities, Buddhist and Muslim, treasure their access. Kuragala's significance for Buddhists is due to its location on the ancient pilgrimage route from the south of the island to Sripada, and Kuragala's significance for Muslims derives from its link with the Persian Sufi mystic Abdul Qadir al-Gilani. So you can see Sufi hermitage shrine of Daftar Jilani inside the archaeological site of Kuragala, and also you see the ruins of Buddhist pagodas and some ruins of Buddhist architecture inside the Kuragala archaeological site. Kuragala made a popular pilgrim site immediately after the opening of newly constructed magnificent landscape of Kuragala ancient Buddhist temple. This construction was constructed with the help of Sri Lanka Defence or the military forces. Since its opening in 2021, hundreds of thousands of pilgrims have been visiting the place. While doing ethnography in Kuragala, what I found out was that people, particularly from both rural and urban Sri Lanka, visit Kuragala not because it's a sacred site, but more touristic. They are amazed by the magnificent construction of the lion, the statue of the deity Mahasumana Saman. However, with the sunset, different groups of pilgrims offered various types of pujas or worship rituals to god Mahasumana Saman. Most of the pilgrims had visited Kuragala because they were told that it's a place for Sinhalese Buddhists, or they had seen social media posts related to Kuragala and the newly constructed these statues. And most of these pilgrims believe that both construction of the lion and the Mahasumana god represent Sinhalese Buddhists. Thus, the lion represents the history of Sinhalese and their association with the myth of lion, while Mahasumana Saman god is one of the guardian deities of Sri Lanka and the provincial ruler of Sabaragamu region where Kuragala is located. More importantly, during the period of Kandyan Kingdom, South Indian Nayakar dynasty introduced the goddess Pattini, replacing god Saman Sumana. Thus, from this narration, it is obvious the process of reconstruction of a lost identity of Sinhalese Buddhists. Not only the self-identity, but also the place identity. Kuragala is well known now through pilgrimages, through oral narrations, and through images shared on social media. Among these agencies, pilgrimages play a significant role in reconstructing the identity of Sinhalese Buddhists, which is directly associated with the state. Because pilgrimages to sites like Kuragala, it produces sacralization, as Satan described. It is a sequential process by which tourist flows are marked as meaningful quasi-religious places that make awareness. So if you can look at these 4 photographs, these are newly constructed constructions where you have this Mahasumana Saman. He's the one of the guardians of the island, and the lion. And you see here some of the worshipping rules or pujas for Mahasumana Saman god. And this is actually the pagoda constructed recently. In Kuragala case, awareness is all about the hegemonic ideology of Sinhalese Buddhists. While reconstructing Sinhalese Buddhist identity in Kuragala, others were excluded, especially by restricting the access to the Sufi hermitage shrine of Daftar Jelani. Signboards clearly, if you can see this picture over here, there is a signboard, this yellow signboard. It clearly says that road can only be used by the people visiting the mosque. So these signboards clearly block and prohibit the entrance of Muslims to the temple. Hence, what I can say is places are made and remade through exclusion of minorities. When minorities are excluded with such notices, the pilgrims make an imagination of places eventually as an imagination of the state with a strong consciousness of awareness without others or them. The second anecdote that I am going to describe is quite similar to the previous one. This happened actually a couple of weeks ago when I was doing fieldwork with the students of one of my undergraduate classes in Jaffna in the northern Sri Lanka. The driver of our vehicle asked us whether it is possible to visit the commemoration site of General Densil Kobbakaduwa, a Lieutenant General in Sri Lanka Defence. On his request, we went to see the site. It is a war memorial site where some of the remaining pieces of war machines are displayed. When everyone got off from the van, our resource person, whose hometown is Jaffna, told us that he has never been to this place and he never knew that this place existed. He was quite surprised to see this place, and we had to explain him what it is and why it has been constructed there. He took a couple of photographs of the site to show them to his parents, who live 20 to 30 kilometers away from the site. Surprisingly, the site is crowded with pilgrims. They were pilgrims because they had worn white clothes. White clothes are usually the dress code among Sinhalese Buddhist pilgrims. Although Jaffna is dominated by Tamil Hindus and Tamil language, it has become one of the popular pilgrimage sites for Sinhalese Buddhists, especially after the end of the Civil War. Sinhalese Buddhists primarily visit Nagadeepa Buddhist temple in Jaffna. It is one of the 16 holiest Buddhist shrines in Sri Lanka. Though the purpose of Jaffna pilgrimage is to visit Nagadeepa Buddhist temple, every group from Jaffna never forget to visit war memorial site, like the General Kobbakaduwa Memorial Place. This particular narration identifies two processes. First, the pilgrimage, sacred pilgrimages transform into war tourism site scene. Second, through that transformation, placemaking occurs without the locals in Jaffna, without any association with locals. So you over here, you can see buses coming to the memorial site and some of the visitors who actually go and see the site. Using these two anecdotes I just explained, I attempted to understand the political geography of the shift that pilgrimage has undergone among Sinhalese Buddhists and how pilgrimage has become an everyday practice in state making. In analyzing data gathered from ethnography, these two case studies clearly explain place-making process, or in other words, place-making, or this can even labeled as territory making, is which is important in state building or state making process. This is where I borrow the concept of institutionalization from the Finnish geographer Anssi Pasi. Pasi uses institutionalization of regions to refer the process of territory building. But looking at different scales and the context, I would like to propose the process in Kuragala and Jaffna as institutionalization of sacredness. Institutionalization of sacredness is a process during which places or territories emerge on various scale and contexts through pilgrimages without any association to others or minorities. Sacredness is produced in this context in two ways: through religious practices or through ethno-symbolism, and through celebrating or commemorating war heroes. Through pilgrimages, places emerge as part of the socio-spatial system and become established and identified in social action and social consciousness. This social consciousness is actually a state of imagination of awareness. In this context, awareness is about being Sinhalese Buddhist and about Sinhala Buddhist state. This social consciousness or the imagination seems very strong when our places are made in others' places. When pilgrims see the notices restricting the entrance to mosque, they tend to believe that it's their territory, and others or Muslims in Kuragala case are the outsiders or enemies whose presence in the same space could make conflict. Thus, presenting others using borders or boundaries on the same place can produce a strong sense of place. That is to protect sacredness from others. However, social consciousness is not merely an imagination. It becomes a reality through symbolic representations. The lion and the goat Saman Sumana have transformed and reconstructed the Sinhalese Buddhist identity, not only in Kuragala, but also in places outside Sabaragamua or outside goat Sumana Saman's regional territory have now become sacred sites for Mahasumana Saman. With these new dynamics, people recognize goat Saman as Sinhala Buddhist god. because he is one of the guardian deities of the country, and because he represents the Sinhalese Buddhist people, believe that the island is Sinhalese Buddhist state. In Jaffna, it is the language. Tamil language dominates in the cultural landscape in Jaffna. Nevertheless, Sinhalese pilgrims find war memorial sites are sacred because there are only a few places where Sinhala is being used in Jaffna. When people visit these sites, they do not recognize them as war memorial sites in other communities, but places of ours. In that context, these symbols of lion, god Sumana, and the Sinhala language in Tamil landscape constitute a territorial iconography and become part of everyday life in social, political, administrative, and economic practices. Thus the notion of a state, Sinhalese Buddhist state, that emerges from institutionalization of sacredness explains a hegemonic narrative of the Sinhala Buddhist state. Sinhala Buddhist state is shaped and reconstructed by the everyday practice of pilgrimages. Whether it is everyday experience or everyday life, why it is so important, why this concept of everyday is such a powerful concept. Although the term everyday seems very informal, it is really not. Let me now finish the presentation by briefly describing to you how powerful is everyday and everyday life in Sri Lanka state. Taking Henry Lefebvre's idea, everyday state is simultaneously the site of the theater for great indestructible practices and the processes imposed by different institutions of production, consumption, circulation, and habitat. Therefore, I would like to conclude my talk arguing that pilgrimage provide essential grounds for the everyday experience of the Sinhalese Buddhist statehood through institutionalization of sacredness. Sacredness is produced through war memorial sites or war memorial spaces and ethno-symbols such as the lion and the god Sama. Thus, the everyday experience of a state is undergone by making places containing awareness. Everyday state is therefore about shaping, reshaping, and maintaining the hegemonic ideology, excluding minorities and others. I will stop here, and I would like to answer any questions you may have. Thank you.
Thanks, Professor Thamali. Correct. This symbols play important role in construction of memories, and if you look at the civil wars the post-colonial states faced, in almost all post-colonial states, whenever the majority comes into power or a majoritarian government comes into power, their first attack is to attack those symbols, to erase the memories of the minority community and to rebuild a different memory, given a different history coming out from the history, politics, etc. Thanks for your wonderful presentation. And now I have a question which three of you can answer. I will start from me, and then we have a question from the audience. How over the years, nature of individual states? Professor Dina?
Sorry, yeah.
Yeah.
Sorry, I didn't hear your question.
So before I take questions from the audience, I want to ask a question which three of you can respond to. How over the years the nature of the state has changed, South Asian states, and especially if you look into the details, you find that how it has affected the citizens, because the liberal capitalist state are mainly supported by the majoritarian groups. So how it has affected especially the minorities? What has affected the minority community? So you can start with Digni.
You want me to start?
Yeah, you can start.
Oh, okay. I need a minute. That's a huge question. I think the first thing to say is, although I guess if we were taking Sri Lanka, Pakistan, India, and Bangladesh, without taking Nepal and Afghanistan and whatever else, we could say that one thing all of these places today have in common is the inheritance of colonial bureaucracies and colonial militaries, right? That's one thing that the states have in common. But aside from that, and laws, of course, the entire legal structure, whether you're talking about Section 377 or whatever else, countries, these countries share specific colonial inheritances. The question is, how has the nature of but given that, I don't know if we can talk about a South Asian state, right? I think this is something that Professor Daschle was also saying, that the state in South Asia has usually been thought of as the state in India, and then everything else is sort of, that's the norm, and everything else is the particular, right? I can only talk about Bangladesh, and I think one of the things we see is that how, despite having a common structure from, the empire, despite the inheritances of empire, states have, on the one hand, evolved or developed or unfolded in very specific ways that have had to do with the nature of politics, the nature of geopolitics. I'm always very fascinated by comparisons between Pakistan and Bangladesh, which are two in which the states have gone in different directions, I think in part, this is just one thing, in part because of very different geopolitical significance. The kind of importance of Pakistan to all kinds of actors has meant a particular kind of dependency and shaping of the state that's simply not there in Bangladesh. Bangladesh emerges as independent in the waning years of the Cold War, right? And it becomes, the state is all about the developmental state, the experimental state. That's a distinction I can think of. And Bangladesh is from birth a neoliberal state. Okay, except for maybe the first year or two. It doesn't wait until 1990 to get IMF loans. It begins almost from the outset to have that. So neoliberalism, or whatever you want to call it, an open market policy, has been there fairly uncontested. It's naturalized in a way that is very different from India. In relation to minorities, and I could babble on, how has this affected citizenship? Naomi Hussein, who will be on later in one of the other panels when I won't be here, it talks about how the state is actually in Bangladesh, because of the conditions of its emergence, is particularly attentive to citizens. I'm not as sanguine as her, but I will say that the Bangladeshi state is based on a certain idea of what it owes its citizens. And even though all states are based ultimately on, or no, derive legitimacy on a certain kind of majoritarianism, it's interesting. I think in Bangladesh, it's shifting, but until very recently, the other in Bangladesh was not a religious other so much as an ethnic, the non-Bengali other. All right, so it makes for a different kind of majoritarianism. It was very much secularism is about Bengalis and Hindus and Buddhists and all, we are all Bengali. That's still very exclusionary when it comes to non-Bengalis, but it works in a particular kind of way, right? So the problems of citizenship are not, for instance, what India is facing right now. I understand there's a lot of marginalization of Hindus and Muslims that's going on there. There are many reasons for that. But I think in terms of the nature of the state does not need that to fortify the nation and continue.
Thanks.
It's just on the spot thinking, but.
Dr. Marcus?
Yes, okay. I mean, it's a really difficult question, but I think one thing that struck me from my own project is that a kind of governmentality that is neoliberal and deliberately likes to leave spaces in order to make populations more governable in an ironic kind of relationship, very often encourages community formations that, of course, then reinforce all sorts of identity constructs, including religious identity constructs and also religious minority constructs. So to give you an example, in the context of Korangi, the Doxiadis company provided for mosques on the master plan. But as it turned out, people set up their own mosques in unclaimed land. And the state basically tolerated this and didn't enforce planning legislation. And the people who built those unauthorized mosques all congregated around certain religious networks. And once the Sunni or different varieties of Sunni religion started to, or religious affiliation, madhab, tried this, Shia groups had to do it in competition as well. So by leaving certain spaces open, I think the state can encourage the solidification of community identities that is precisely not the creation of individual citizens. And I think that's something that kind of is happening quite a lot. Second, and I think that's probably applies more to India than Pakistan, but we all know that leaving, again, states, certain spaces ungoverned, for example, who can live where, you can give carte blanche to local community organizations to be as discriminatory as they like. So, for example, if the state withdraws from housing or mass housing policy, private developers can say that they don't want members of a particular religious community to live in a particular housing block. And to create a small state, a neoliberal state, actually makes that very easy. And I think that's something that we've seen from the 1990s onwards, particularly in India, where kind of religious exclusive spaces get created through market forces because the state has been rolled back. But to return to Pakistan, another good example, I think, is the so-called blasphemy law. Because the blasphemy law, which is all about putting minority communities in their place, whether they are what we would call, looking in from the outside, perhaps secularists, Christians, but also Shias and other minority groups, is really a dance between state and non-state actors. It is not simply a legal framework, because the way these agitations around the blasphemy law unfold is always that some community-based non-state actor starts an agitation by making an accusation, then starts mobilizing outside the state apparatus, and then in the end forcing the state apparatus to prosecute somebody under that law. And of course, sometimes the state is holding back. And I think it's actually, in a way, a kind of deliberate, it's almost a system that has been deliberately set up, because it helps to reaffirm the primacy of Sunni Muslim identity in Pakistan without the state actually having to directly enshrine that. So in a way, the state depends with this stance with religious radicals who make these demands from the outside, and the actual effect of discrimination emerges through the interaction between non-state and state actors in this case. And again, that's something that's kind of become very important, I think, from the 1980s, 90s onwards, and is still going. So these are examples that I could bring.
Thanks, Dr. Marcus. Professor Themli?
Yes, so again, it's a broad question. I will try to brief my answer. Like, I will try to answer your question, the nature of his state, in two ways. Like, first, if you look at the current context of Sri Lanka as a state, we can actually unfold within its context of geopolitics, because we are a small country, we are an island nation, and we are located in the Indian Ocean. We are the immediate neighbor of the massive or the huge the economy, one of the economies of the world, like India. And also it is although we are in the Indian Ocean, we actually have this geopolitical pressure from USA, China, and also from Russia. So we are actually one of these players where we try to find our own identity at one point, and also we are also trying to survive within all these geopolitical context. On the other hand, like from my own experience, what I can say is as a country which experienced 30 years of civil war, actually the people of Sri Lanka still, they define and they see the state as something directly connected with the ethnicity. So they still believe that this is an ethnic-based nation. This is something to do with the one ethnic group. When it comes to ethnicity, then again, it directly associates with the religion. So although it's been like more than 10 years since the civil war is over, we still talk about the Sinhalese Buddhist nation. Sometimes people, I mean, there are discussions over like what happens to this multicultural nation then.
Thanks, Professor. I have questions from the audience. Let's start with Professor Thamli. The question is, in your talk, I was interested, not question from an audience. In your talk, I was interested how the popular religious groups perceived the state and its intersection with religion. Is there a difference among the local Kuragala residents? Do they perceive the state along different lines than religious identity?
Yes, that's an interesting question, but I'm not sure what these popular religious groups mean. Like different religious groups, or
is there a difference among the local Kuragala residents?
Question, yes. So yes, when I talk to residents, the locals of Kuragala, they saw this particular newly constructed temple as something to do with economy, because this particular temple brings pilgrimages to the village, and as a result of that, they could actually do some economic activities. For example, they actually have started new businesses, selling goods, selling toys, and as a result of that, they see the new construction as in terms of economy, like this is something to do with the economy, or that provides that provide a way of income.
And then there's a question for Dr. Marcus from us audience that could you cite some work on how state can relate to its citizens through private/non-state entities?
Okay, that's actually quite a hard one because I'm very bad as a walking bibliography, generally speaking. There's probably 1,000,001 works, and I would say, I mean, if you want to kind of start the theoretical ball rolling, I would probably go for Foucault's lectures on ordoliberalism, where he does actually make some points, but it's not kind of easy use. But if you want to get my email address from the organizers, I'm very happy to share that, and then we can take that offline, and I can answer your question a bit more fully. But I can't give you kind of just one or two quotes just off the cuff, as it were, if that's all right.
Yeah. Then there's a question for Professor Dina, that is surveillance of Bangladesh garment sector impacted by international labor movements and rights groups advocating on behalf of more ethical garments?
Right. Thank you. It's actually an interesting question. Yes, to some extent, at least the rhetoric on surveillance is impacted by the global gaze, as I call it. There's the brand, the gaze of the brand versus the gaze of international labor movements, because after all, what Bangladesh has to sell, its brand, is cheapened labor. So it has to look good. It can provide cheap labor, but it also has to look good that, the labor is is not too exploitative, right? So there's always a tightrope. And I think the way in which it wants to keep the labor in control. Let me start off by saying that Bangladesh is a very transnational space, like all of these places we're talking about. And when you have something like the garment industry, things like working conditions and wages are not issues that are self-contained within the borders of the nation state, obviously, because if you raise wages too much, the international system is that factories will go elsewhere. So there's this balancing act that people have to do. That said, I think the way in which surveillance works, it's not just surveillance, but control of labor works, is that it's very convenient to have external actors like international labor movements and others, because there is a rhetoric of conspiracy that can be mobilized. You can say, look, those people don't really care about workers and workers' rights. What they want to do is they're actually working for our competitors in these other countries, and they want to damage or undermine our industry. So we want to actually keep them out, and we have to have tighter controls on our workers who seem to be colluding or collaborating with people outside. So this really discourages. There is a lot of surveillance around groups who have connections, international connections. That's certainly very true. And then there is also the image of the dalal, or the national traitor. And again, there's a long colonial history of the idea of the traitor who goes against national interest and against the interest of the economy. And again, there's a folding of the conspirator and the person who goes against the national interest, the traitor, and the foreigner. All of those reinforces both the discourse and the practice of surveillance. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Yeah, Dr. Marcus, I saw your messages. If you want, you can ask. So I would love to.
No, sorry, it wasn't a question actually. It was just a suggestion for Dr. Tamali's project, which I thought may be helpful to her. It's about a case study in Bosnia, where again a pilgrimage center was discovered all out of a sudden in a place where there was traumatic war crimes committed a few decades earlier, and where Catholic and Croat nationalists tried to claim territory, which I think might be quite good for discussion, but it's not for wider discussion. So I'm happy to leave it in the chat.
Yeah, sure. The final question I have, it's open to everyone. How did you conduct ethnography in order to learn the everyday experiences of the state? Briefly talk about the tools of data collection also. This is from one of the audience. I repeat, how did you conduct ethnography in order to learn the everyday experiences of the state? Briefly talk about the tools of data collection also. So, Professor Thamli, can start with you?
Yes, so what I do is I usually I prefer doing interviews and focus group discussions mainly, and also it is not only always about interviews and focus group discussions, but what I do is I go to the field and I actually try to stay in that particular region like couple of weeks, and then I try to get a basic idea about what exactly this community is and how what they do and how they are related to my research subject, and then only I start doing interviews. and focus group discussions. Then again, my positionality always influence my research or in collecting data. But there are certain like tricks I follow. For example, in certain cases, I actually follow up some interviews using one of my research assistants that I find very helpful in developing a database. And it actually helped me even during when I was doing my PhD, because sometimes I feel so difficult to get these people talk because they also look at me from a perspective like, you also work in a university, so you are also coming from the state. So how can we trust you? So that question is always there. So in certain cases, what I do is I use my research assistant, and then I do not engage with interviews. My research assistant do all the fieldwork. So that is one aspect of ethnography that I do. I think I think others can actually. Professor Dina might have a lot of experience than me because I'm a junior research fellow right now. So maybe they can also say a couple of things about that.
Professor Dina?
Yeah, I am feeling my age now. Yes. Thank you, Dr. Thamali. I think I do something at this point, having worked on the field of labor in Bangladesh for over 25 years. I think I would say I do what I would call slow ethnography. I'm kind of at this phase in life where I don't need to go ask a specific set of questions. So I often find myself really just going to people I know and just being with them, figuring out, like this whole thing about surveillance. I wanted to learn about, I went to this woman who called me 2 weeks ago. I went to her last summer in August. I went to her office and I said, I want to know why garment workers are wearing veils all of a sudden. And she's like, oh, okay, I'll let you know. But then she started complaining about the DGFI. It was interesting. And I just had that in my mind. And then she called me, it's all very, I don't have necessarily, so the field work I think of as very open to what is, I have to be very attuned to what people feel is important. And I think I have the luxury of doing that. And when you don't have immediate projects, and you don't have especially NGOized projects where you have to go and ask a set of questions. I mean, of course, I eventually ask a set of questions, but, I will spend hours, days, just listening to people. And I think that's a very good way to get a sense of what's going on. But I have all of those years of connections to work on, and I keep making those connections. And I'm at this point where people are asking me for advice on whether or not to leave the country, so it's a very different relationship with one's interlocutors.
Dr. Marcus?
Yes, I mean, of course, I'm a historian, so in a way, I'm less qualified to answer this. In the project on Pakistani mass housing, I was mostly getting information from the archives. And I mean, some people have likened some ways of reading the archives to some form of anthropological research as well, because you're always thinking about, how an archive has been put together, how people interact with an archive, how the archive has been used. You don't just read it to kind of get raw data out of it. But in this particular case, what I could find were petition letters, for example, or the minutes of low-level political meetings, and I then tried to make sense of this. But more widely, in other contexts, I'm also using oral history, and I think that's quite probably most closely related to anthropology, anthropological fieldwork, and it always includes a little bit, some elements of that. I mean, for example, you have to be very clear about your own position in an interview and how your own presence shapes the narrative that is being told. So it is always about interrogating your own position. But at the same time, I think it's probably less embedded in community life and more focused at particular people who I try to talk to for extended periods of time. So I don't go around and use a questionnaire and, once somebody's answered the 10 questions on my list, I say next. I actually sit down with somebody and try to get them to talk for 2-3 hours if we can, without any clear aim, because usually the first hour people just tell you what they want to tell you, and the next 2 hours they tell you what comes out, and far more significant information in many ways. And then you have to look at it and write it up and analyze it almost from a literary studies perspective. But it's a very different approach to, I guess, if you're a social scientist.
Yeah. Thanks. Now it's 12:30 in Singapore, so that's allocated time. So we have finished. And I thanks everyone for wonderful presentation and insightful talk, answering the questions from the audience and even from me. And we would like to see you again in the next ISAS event. So thank you all.
Thank you.
Thanks.
So-
Bye.